The rain began just as the afternoon light began to soften, the way rain sometimes does, not with a dramatic clap of thunder or a sudden downpour that sends people scrambling for cover, but with a gentle, almost apologetic tapping against the window panes, as if the sky were asking permission before it began to cry. And by the time the first delicate drops had traced their crooked little paths down the glass of every shop window along Millbrook Lane, the world had already decided to slow down, to soften, to settle into the kind of quiet that only a rainy afternoon can bring. It was the kind of rain that didn't demand attention. It simply arrived and wrapped itself around the little town like a well-loved blanket, muffling the sounds of passing cars and distant conversations, turning the pavement into a mosaic of reflected lamplights and scattered leaves. The air smelled of wet stone and earth and something older, something that reached all the way back to childhood memories of pressing one's face against a fogged-up window and feeling, for no particular reason, perfectly safe. And it was on this particular afternoon, with the rain falling in its quiet, unhurried way, that a woman named Alara found herself standing beneath the narrow awning of a small bakery she had never noticed before. Now, this was unusual for several reasons. Alara had lived in the town of Millbrook for nearly 3 years. She walked along Millbrook Lane every single morning on her way to the bookshop where she worked, and every single evening on her way home. She considered herself a person who paid attention to things, who noticed the way the light fell differently on the old stone church depending on the season, who knew which window boxes bloomed first in the spring, who could tell you the exact spot on the sidewalk where a large tree root had pushed the concrete up into a little tripping hazard that everyone in town had learned to step over without thinking. And yet here was a bakery right there between the clockmaker's shop and the little storefront that sold handmade candles that she had somehow never seen. The sign above the door was painted in a deep, warm brown, the color of well-baked bread, and the letters were curling and soft, as if they had been written by someone who believed that even words should feel comfortable. They read, "The Rainy Day Bakery." Beneath the name, in smaller, even gentler letters, were the words, "Open when you need us." Alara tilted her head slightly, the way a bird does when it hears an unfamiliar sound. She was sure, absolutely sure, that this space had been something else yesterday. A dark window, an empty shop, a place she had passed 100 times without a second glance. And now here it was, warm light glowing behind the glass, a small chalkboard sign on the sidewalk displaying a single sentence in cheerful, rounded handwriting. "Come in out of the rain. You're exactly where you need to be." The rain picked up just slightly, not enough to be alarming, but enough to remind her that she did not have an umbrella, and that her wool coat, while charming in a rustic sort of way, was not particularly waterproof. A droplet landed on the tip of her nose, and she blinked. Well, she thought, that's rather persuasive. She pushed open the door. The bell above the door made a sound that was less of a ring and more of a hum, a warm, resonant note that seemed to travel through the air like a slow wave, settling into the walls and the floor and the bones of anyone standing nearby. It was the kind of sound that, if you were very tired, might make you want to close your eyes for just a moment, just to see where it would take you. The inside of the bakery was everything the outside had promised and more. It was warm, not the sterile, artificial warmth of a heating system working too hard, but the kind of deep, layered warmth that comes from ovens that have been on for hours, from bread that has been baking slowly and patiently, from walls made of old brick that have learned, over many years. How to hold onto heat the way a grandparent holds onto a sleeping child, gently and with great care. The ceiling was low enough to feel enclosing in the most comforting sense of the word, and it was made of dark wooden beams that crossed and recrossed each other in patterns that didn't quite make sense, but were deeply pleasing to look at. Between the beams, the ceiling was plastered in a warm, creamy white, and someone, some kindly, artistic soul, had painted tiny golden stars across it, each one slightly different in size and shape, as if they were trying to capture the exact moment when a sky full of stars first begins to appear at dusk. The floor was made of wide, old floorboards that creaked softly underfoot, each creak sounding like a quiet greeting, as if the building itself was saying, "Hello, I'm glad you're here." The boards were worn smooth in the middle of the walkway, where countless feet had passed over the years, and the color was a rich, honeyed brown that seemed to glow from within. But it was the smell that stopped Elira completely. It was not one smell, but many, all layered together like voices in a choir, each one distinct, but contributing to something larger, something that made the chest expand and the shoulders drop and the mind go very, very quiet. There was the deep, earthy aroma of rye bread baking, dense and dark and slightly sour, the kind of bread that takes hours to rise and tastes like it has stories to tell. There was the sweeter, lighter scent of vanilla drifting from somewhere near the back of the shop like a whisper. There was cinnamon, warm and woody and familiar, the smell of every good thing that had ever happened in a kitchen. There was butter, real butter, the kind that turns golden and foamy in a pan and makes a sound like soft applause. And beneath it all, holding everything together like a bass note in a song, there was the clean, simple smell of flour. Just flour, ground wheat, and nothing else. The most basic and essential of baking ingredients, And somehow, in this moment, the most comforting, Alara breathed in, and her eyes closed of their own accord. And when she opened them again, she realized that she had been standing just inside the door for what must have been nearly a full minute, simply breathing. "Take your time," said a voice from somewhere inside the shop. "There's no rush here. There's never any rush here." Alara looked up. Behind the long wooden counter that stretched along the left side of the bakery stood a woman of an age that was impossible to determine. She might have been 50. She might have been 70. She might have been 112. Her face was round and soft and lined in the way that faces become lined when they have spent many years smiling. And her eyes were the color of warm caramel, and they crinkled at the corners so deeply that it seemed as though smiling was not something she did, but something she simply was. Her hair was silver white and pulled back loosely, and a few strands had escaped to frame her face, and she wore an apron that was dusted with flour and smeared with something that might have been chocolate and spotted with something that was almost certainly cinnamon. And she looked in every possible way like exactly the kind of person you would want to find standing behind the counter of a bakery that appeared out of nowhere on a rainy afternoon. "I'm Marguerite," the woman said, and she said it in a way that made the name sound like an invitation. "And you're soaked. Well, half soaked. The left side of you is quite wet, and the right side is merely damp. Come, sit down. I'll make you something warm." Alara opened her mouth to protest out of habit, because that is what people do when someone offers them kindness unexpectedly. They protest because they have forgotten that kindness does not require a reason. But Marguerite had already turned away, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who has long since stopped believing that speed has any particular value. and Alara found herself following without having made a conscious decision to do so. The seating area of the bakery was arranged in a way that suggested no particular concern for efficiency or logic, but immense concern for comfort. There were a few small wooden tables, each one different sizes, different shapes, different shades of wood, but all sharing the same quality of being solid and well made and slightly imperfect. The kind of tables that have character, that have coffee rings on their surfaces from years of use, and don't mind it at all. Around the tables were chairs of various descriptions. A high-backed wooden chair with a faded cushion tied to the seat. A low armchair upholstered in something that had once been green and was now a gentle, indeterminate sage. A small bench covered in a knitted blanket that looked like it had been made by someone who believed that blankets should be thick enough to feel like a hug. And then there was the window seat. It ran along the entire length of the front wall, a deep, cushioned ledge built beneath the large, foggy windows that looked out onto Millbrook Lane. The cushion was covered in a fabric that was either very old velvet or something trying very hard to look like very old velvet. And it was in a color that might have been burgundy or might have been plum or might have been some word that doesn't exist yet for a color that sits exactly halfway between the two. Behind the cushion, propped against the glass, were an assortment of pillows in various states of wear and fluffiness, some embroidered, some plain. One that appeared to have been knitted out of what looked like the softest wool in the world, in a color that was the exact shade of the rain clouds outside. Alara sat down on the window seat, and the cushion gave beneath her in a way that felt like settling into something, like the way a spoon settles into freshly stirred pudding, or the way a tired body settles into a bed at the end of a very long day. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, and the sound of it was soft and long and seemed to carry away something that had been sitting on her chest for longer than she could remember. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Through the fogged glass, the world looked like a watercolor painting that someone had not quite finished. Soft edges, blurred colors, no hard lines anywhere. The street lamp across the road glowed amber, and its light spread out on the wet pavement in a warm, wavering pool. And Alara watched the raindrops land in that pool and send up tiny, momentary crowns of light before dissolving. And she thought that she had never seen anything so beautiful and so completely without purpose, and that perhaps purposelessness was underrated. She heard Marguerite moving in the kitchen, the quiet clinking of a cup being placed on a saucer, the gentle hiss of a kettle that was nearly ready, the soft sound of a drawer being opened and closed. These sounds reached Alara not as individual events, but as a continuous stream of reassurance, a kind of auditory blanket being draped over her, stitch by stitch, sound by sound. A few minutes passed, or perhaps it was a few seconds, or perhaps it was an hour. Time in the rainy day bakery seemed to move the way honey moves when you tilt a jar slowly and thickly and with great sweetness, and there was no way to measure it and no reason to try. Then Marguerite appeared, carrying a tray. On the tray was a ceramic mug, thick-walled and heavy, glazed in a deep, warm blue that was almost purple, the kind of mug that holds heat the way a good friend holds a secret. Inside the mug was a liquid that was golden brown and steaming gently, and the smell that rose from it was extraordinary. Honey and lemon and something else, something herbal and green and slightly floral, something that Alara could not identify, but that made her think of gardens after rain and windows left open in summer, and the feeling of waking up and realizing you don't have to be anywhere at all. Alongside the mug was a small plate, and on the plate was a scone. Not a large scone, not a fancy scone, not a scone that was trying to impress anyone. It was simply a scone golden on top, pale and flaky within, dusted with a scattering of sugar that caught the light like tiny crystals. It looked warm, and it looked as though it had been made by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, and had been doing it for a very long time. Chamomile and lavender, and a little honey from the hives out back, Marguerite said, setting the tray down on the small table beside the window seat. And the scone is plain, because sometimes plain is exactly right. There's clotted cream and jam if you want them, but try it first without anything, just to see. Ilara wrapped her hands around the mug. The ceramic was hot against her palms, not too hot, not painfully hot, but hot enough to feel real, hot enough to feel like a small, focused sun had been placed directly into her hands. She lifted the mug to her lips and took a sip. The tea was warm. That was the first thing she noticed, not the flavor, not the temperature in any specific sense, but the warmth. It moved through her mouth and down her throat and into her chest, and then outward, radiating through her body like the feeling of stepping into a bath that is exactly the right temperature, or the feeling of pulling a warm sweater over your head on a cold morning, and feeling it settle around you, still holding the memory of the radiator it had been draped over. The warmth did not ask permission. It simply arrived, and it was welcome. Then the flavors came, one by one, each one taking its turn, as if they had agreed beforehand on the order in which they would present themselves. First came the honey, smooth and golden and sweet, but not cloying, not the aggressive sweetness of processed sugar, but the gentle, rounded sweetness of something that had been made by bees, who took their work seriously and their time generously. Then came the lemon, bright and clean, and just tart enough to make the honey seem even sweeter by comparison. The way a single note of sadness can make happiness feel more vivid. And then, beneath both, came the chamomile and lavender, soft and herbal and slightly floral, calming in a way that was not dramatic but persistent, like the feeling of a hand resting lightly on your shoulder, not pushing or pulling, just there, just reminding you that you are not alone. Alara took another sip, and then another, and between sips, she picked up the scone and broke it open with her thumbs, and it broke with the most satisfying sound, not a crack, not a snap, but a soft, layered whisper, the sound of layers of flaky pastry gently separating from one another, each one thin and tender, and slightly steaming from the heat still trapped inside. She tore off a small piece and placed it in her mouth, and it was, well, it was good. It was deeply, simply, unassumingly good. The outside had just the faintest crispness to it, a whisper of a crust that yielded immediately to the soft, layered interior. It tasted of butter and flour and salt and nothing else, and it tasted of everything important. It tasted like Sunday mornings. It tasted like the kitchen of a house where someone loves you. It tasted like the kind of food that does not need to prove anything, because it has already, in its very first moment of existence, achieved exactly what it set out to achieve. Alara chewed slowly. She swallowed. She took another sip of tea. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the window, and inside, the bakery held its warmth around her like arms, and she felt something happen inside her chest, something loosening, something releasing, like a knot that had been tied for so long that the rope had forgotten it was supposed to be straight. And now, finally, slowly, was beginning to remember. There, Marguerite said, from somewhere behind the counter. She wasn't looking at Alara. She was arranging something on a tray a small pot of jam, a little dish of clotted cream, a shortbread biscuit that had been broken in half, probably by accident, probably not. That's better. I can always tell when someone's been carrying something heavy. Not a physical something, though those are heavy too. The other kind. The kind you can't see, but you can feel. Like a stone in your pocket that you keep forgetting is there. Until you sit down and it presses against your thigh and you think, oh, that's why I've been walking crooked. Alara blinked. She had not said a single word since entering the bakery. She had not explained anything about herself, about her life, about why she had been walking down Millbrook Lane in the rain without an umbrella on a Tuesday afternoon when she should have been at the bookshop. And yet, Marguerite's words landed with the precision of an arrow, finding the center of a target that it couldn't possibly see. Marguerite looked up then, and her caramel eyes held Alara's gaze with a warmth that was not intrusive, not probing, but simply present, the way a lamp is present in a dark room, not demanding that you look at it, but available if you need it. You don't have to talk, Marguerite said. You don't have to explain. You don't have to do anything at all except sit there and drink your tea and eat your scone and listen to the rain. That's what this place is for. That's all it's for. And so Alara did. She sat in the window seat, and she drank her tea, and she ate her scone slowly, because there was no reason to do anything slowly, except that slowness felt like the natural state of being in this place, as if the bakery operated on a different frequency than the world outside, a frequency where time moved at the speed of rising bread and steeping tea and falling rain. As she sat, she began to notice things. She noticed that the bakery was full of small, beautiful details that revealed themselves only when you stopped looking for them. Above the counter, there was a row of old-fashioned scales, balanced bronze scales with brass plates, and little weights shaped like acorns and stars and crescent moons. They were not for weighing anything practical. They were simply there, arranged along a narrow shelf, and some of them were balanced perfectly, and some were tilted slightly to one side, as if they were in the middle of weighing something invisible, something like the weight of a thought, or the weight of a feeling, or the weight of a Tuesday afternoon in October when the rain is falling and you have nowhere particular to be. On the wall behind the counter, there was a clock. It was a large, round clock with a white face and black numbers, and it appeared to be entirely ordinary except for one detail. The hands were not moving. They were frozen in place, pointing to a time that Alara could not quite read. The numbers seemed to shift slightly when she looked directly at them. The way stars seem to disappear when you look straight at them, but reappear in your peripheral vision. She mentioned this to Marguerite, or rather, she didn't mention it because she didn't say anything, but Marguerite seemed to sense the direction of her gaze. The clock doesn't measure time, Marguerite said, wiping down the counter with a cloth that was probably older than Alara. It measures something else. I'm not entirely sure what. I think it might be the distance between where you are and where you need to be, or the distance between who you are and who you're becoming, or possibly it's just broken. I've never been entirely sure, and I've stopped worrying about it. She smiled then, and the smile was like the scone, simple, unassuming, and exactly right. Alara noticed the shelves along the back wall. They were lined with jars, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, in all shapes and sizes. Some were tall and slender. Some were short and wide. Some were made of clear glass, and some of amber glass, and some of a deep cobalt blue. Inside each jar was something different. One was filled with a pale golden powder that that might have been finely ground vanilla bean. Another held dark, glossy seeds that looked like tiny black pearls. Another was filled with something that looked like dried lavender, but shimmered faintly in the light, as if each tiny flower was holding onto a small piece of the sun it had grown under. The jars had handwritten labels, but the writing was in a language that Alara did not recognize, not because it was foreign, but because it seemed to be made of words that were felt rather than read, words that conveyed meaning not through letters, but through some deeper, older channel of understanding. She noticed the music. It was so faint that she had not registered it at first. It was not coming from a speaker or an instrument, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the bricks and the wood and the air, as if the building had absorbed the sounds of every conversation and every footstep and every sigh that had ever occurred within it, and was now releasing them very gently, like a slow exhale. It was not a melody in any conventional sense. It was more like a texture, a warm, humming texture made of low tones and soft vibrations, and the occasional high, clear note that drifted through like a bird passing through a room and then vanishing out the window. It was the kind of music that you didn't listen to with your ears, but with your entire body, the kind that made you feel as though you were being held in something larger than yourself. And she noticed the other customers. There were not many, 3 to be exact, but each one seemed to exist in their own private bubble of comfort, as if the bakery had wrapped each of them individually in its warmth, like a baker wrapping loaves of bread in cloth. In one corner, in the high-backed wooden chair with the faded cushion, sat an old man. He was very old in the way that mountains are old in the way that suggests he had been alive for so long that he had become part of the landscape rather than a person moving through it. He had a magnificent white mustache curled up at the ends like the decorative swirls on a wedding cake. And he was wearing a tweed jacket that had been patched in at least 4 places with fabric that did not quite match, but somehow looked better than the original. He was reading a book, a real book, with a leather cover and yellowed pages. And he was reading it with the kind of slow, absorbed attention that is rarely seen anymore. The kind of reading that is not about consuming information, but about inhabiting a world. He turned the pages with great deliberation, lifting each one carefully between his thumb and forefinger, as if each page was a thin sheet of something precious. And between pages, he would pause and look out the window at the rain, and his expression was one of such profound contentment that it made Alara's heart ache in the most gentle way, like a muscle that is being stretched after being still for too long. At a table near the door, 2 young women sat across from each other. They were both in their mid-20s, perhaps, and they were not talking. This, in itself, was notable, because 2 young women sitting across from each other in a cafe are, by all social conventions, supposed to be talking. But these 2 were not. One was drawing in a sketchbook large, sweeping strokes of charcoal that moved across the page with a kind of controlled wildness, like a river that knows exactly where it's going, even though it looks like it's going everywhere at once. The other was simply sitting with her hands wrapped around a mug, similar to Alara's mug, but glazed in a deep forest green. And she was watching her friend draw with an expression of quiet admiration, the way you might watch a fire burn or a bird build a nest, not needing to participate, just needing to witness. Occasionally, the one who was drawing would look up and catch the other's eye, and one of them would smile a small, private smile that passed between them like a secret. And then the one who was drawing would look back down and continue, one who was watching would continue to watch, and the silence between them was not empty, but full. Full the way a room is full when it's full of good light. And in the armchair, the sagging, sage-green armchair near the back of the shop, there was a dog. Not a specific breed, or rather, a breed so thoroughly mixed that it had become its own category. A one-of-a-kind creation that could never be replicated. It was medium-sized and golden brown, with floppy ears and soft, dark eyes, and a muzzle that was going gray around the edges, suggesting a certain maturity of years. It was lying in the armchair, with its chin resting on the armrest and its eyes half closed. And it was breathing in a slow, rhythmic pattern, in, out, in, out. That was so even and so deep and so measured that it seemed almost like a metronome, keeping time for the entire bakery. Its coat looked soft, the kind of soft that makes you want to bury your face in it and breathe in the smell of warm fur and sunshine, and the particular muskiness that dogs carry with them like a signature. One of its back legs was twitching slightly, just the faintest tremor, and Alara wondered what the dog was dreaming about. A field, probably. A field with long grass and a ball that never stops bouncing, and the sound of someone laughing. "That's Barnaby," Marguerite said, following Alara's gaze. "He comes in every rainy day, has done for years. I don't know where he lives. I don't know who he belongs to. He just appears when the rain starts and leaves when it stops. I've stopped trying to understand it. Some things aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be appreciated." Barnaby's tail gave a single, slow thump against the cushion of the armchair, as if he had heard his name and was acknowledging it, but didn't want to make a fuss about it. Ilara smiled. It was a small smile, a private smile, the kind of smile that doesn't need to be seen by anyone else, because it is not for anyone else. It is for the person who is smiling, and for the moment that caused it, and for the strange, sweet, slightly inexplicable fact of being alive and sitting in a window seat in a bakery that may or may not have existed before today, drinking tea that tastes like gardens, and eating a scone that tastes like love, and watching the rain fall on a street that looks like a watercolor painting. She finished her scone. She finished her tea. The mug was empty, but it was still warm, and she kept holding it because holding it felt good, her hands around the smooth, curved ceramic, the residual heat seeping into her palms like a slow goodbye. Marguerite appeared again, silently, the way she did everything, without announcement, without fuss, without the sense that she was performing a service, but rather that she was simply participating in the natural flow of kindness, that the bakery seemed to generate the way a fire generates heat. She carried the teapot, the same deep blue ceramic as the mug, and she refilled Alara's cup without asking, because asking would have implied that there was a possibility of refusal. And in the rainy day bakery, there was no possibility of refusal when it came to more tea. There's a story in this place, Marguerite said, settling into the chair across from the window seat, the one with the knitted blanket draped over its back. She sat with the ease of someone who has sat in the same chair thousands of times and knows exactly how it will receive her weight, exactly where to place her hands, exactly how far to lean back. Not a dramatic story, not a story with villains or conflicts or cliffhangers, just a story, the way stories used to be before we decided they needed to be exciting. Would you like to hear it? Alara nodded. She nodded slowly, because fast nodding would have been wrong in this place, would have disrupted the frequency, would have been like shouting in a library or running in a garden. Marguerite folded her hands in her lap. Barnaby, in his armchair, let let out a long, soft sigh that sounded like a punctuation mark. The rain continued. The old man turned a page. The charcoal whispered across the sketchbook paper. Once, Marguerite began, there was a woman who baked bread. She paused. The pause was not empty. It was full of expectation, full of the particular quality of silence that exists just before a story begins. The silence that is not an absence of sound, but a gathering of attention, a drawing in of breath, a collective leaning forward. She wasn't a famous woman. She wasn't a wealthy woman. She wasn't a woman who had ever done anything that the world would consider remarkable. She had not climbed mountains, or discovered anything, or written anything that would be remembered. She had simply lived in a small house at the end of a small lane, in a small town that was not particularly notable for anything except being the kind of town where people said good morning to each other and meant it. Marguerite's voice was unhurried. Each word was given its full weight, its full measure of time, as if she were laying them down one by one, like stepping stones across a still pond. And each one was meant to bear the weight of the listener's full attention before the next one was placed. But she could bake. Oh, she could bake. She could bake the way some people can sing naturally, instinctively, as if the knowledge of it was built into her bones, encoded in her DNA, alongside breathing and blinking and dreaming. She didn't need recipes. She didn't need measurements. She could feel when the dough was right by pressing her fingertips into it, the way a doctor presses fingertips into a patient's skin, gently, expertly, reading the story the dough was telling her. Too dry, the dough would say, and she would add a little more water. Almost there, it would say, and she would knead it for 3 more minutes, no more, no less. Ready, it would say, and she would set it aside to rest, covering it with a cloth like tucking a child into bed. Outside, the rain shifted. It had been falling steadily, consistently, like a metronome. But now it changed, softened, thinned, became something lighter and more delicate, like a whisper replacing a conversation. The sound of it against the window changed from a tapping to a brushing, as if the rain had decided to be more gentle, as if it, too, was listening to the story. The woman baked every day, not because she had to, not because she was running a business or fulfilling orders or trying to make a living, but because she couldn't not bake. It was what her hands wanted to do when she woke up in the morning. It was what her mind drifted toward when she sat in the evening. It was the language she spoke most fluently, more fluently than words, more fluently than gestures, more fluently than anything else. When she was baking, she was communicating something that she could never have articulated in any other way, something about abundance, about generosity, about the fundamental goodness of taking raw, simple ingredients and transforming them through patience and care and attention into something that could nourish another person. Ilara felt her eyelids growing heavy, not with tiredness exactly, or not with the kind of tiredness that comes from exhaustion or boredom, but with a different kind of heaviness, a pleasant heaviness, the heaviness of relaxation, of letting go, of allowing the muscles around the eyes to release their grip, and the jaw to unclench, and the forehead to smooth out, like a sheet being pulled taut, and then released so that it falls soft and unwrinkled across a bed. She gave away everything she baked, every loaf, every roll, every scone, every pastry. She would set them in a basket on her front porch, and they would disappear. She never saw who took them. She never asked. She simply baked and left them out, and they were taken, and that was enough. She did not need to know who ate her bread. She did not need gratitude or recognition, or even confirmation that the bread was being eaten and not thrown away or fed to birds. she wouldn't have minded if the birds got some, because she liked birds. She trusted that the bread would find its way to where it was needed, and she trusted that this was enough. The old man in the corner closed his book. He didn't mark his page. He simply closed it gently, the way you close the eyes of someone who has fallen asleep. And he set it on the table beside him and folded his hands over it and leaned back in his chair and closed his own eyes. His breathing slowed. His mustache rose and fell with each breath. And he looked, in that moment, like a portrait of peace, the kind of image that someone might paint to represent the concept of contentment. If contentment could be captured in paint. One day, Marguerite continued, her voice dropping slightly, settling into a lower, warmer register, like a fire that has been burning for a while and has found its steady, enduring heat. A storm came to the town, not a small storm, not a gentle rain, a real storm, the kind that makes the windows rattle and the roof creak and the trees bend and sway as if they are dancing to music that only they can hear, the kind of storm that makes you remember that the world is larger than you are and wilder than you are, and that the walls around you are thinner than you usually like to think. The rain outside picked up again, as if on cue, or perhaps not on cue, perhaps in response to the same deep current that was guiding the story, the same mysterious synchronicity that connects stories to the weather, and the weather to moods, and moods to the turning of the earth. It drummed harder against the window, and the wind made a sound like a low, distant hum, and the street lamp across the road flickered once, twice, and then held steady, its amber light wavering but not dying, stubborn and warm against the dark. The woman was in her kitchen when the storm hit. She had been baking, as always. She was in the middle of making a batch of something special, something she only made on days when the sky was dark and the air was heavy, something that she had never named because she didn't need a name for it. It was a bread, sort of, or a cake, or something in between. It was golden and dense and slightly sweet, with a crumb that was so tender it practically melted on the tongue. And it had a flavor that was impossible to pin down, hints of honey and butter and warm spice and something else, something that tasted like the feeling of being safe. Ilara's head was resting against the window now. The glass was cool against her temple, and she could feel the vibration of the rain against it. A subtle, rhythmic trembling that was almost like a massage, almost like the way a cat purrs against your skin when it's sitting on your chest, and the purring travels through your ribs and into your heart and becomes indistinguishable from your own heartbeat. The storm raged for hours. The woman stayed in her kitchen. She didn't light candles. She didn't need to. The oven was on, and the glow from it, orange and warm and steady, was enough. She sat on the floor beside the oven with her back against the warm metal door, and she listened to the storm, and she was not afraid. Not because she was brave. She didn't think of herself as brave. She was simply at home, and the storm was outside, and there was bread in the oven, and some things, when you are inside them, are larger and stronger and more solid than any storm. Marguerite's voice had become something extraordinary. It was no longer just a voice. It was a texture, a presence, a warm current that flowed through the bakery like the scent of baking bread, filling every corner, every crack, every molecule of air. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and the floor and the ceiling and the rain and the old wooden beams and the worn floorboards and the fogged windows. It was a voice that felt like being tucked in. And while she sat there, something happened. Something small. Something that would have been invisible to anyone watching. except there was no one watching, because the storm had driven everyone indoors, and the woman was alone, the kind of alone that is not lonely, but simply solitary, the way a tree is solitary in a field, complete in itself, not needing anything beyond what it already is. The bread began to smell, not just good, not just the normal, wonderful smell of bread baking, something more, something that reached beyond the kitchen and beyond the house and out into the storm itself, as if the smell had weight and substance and a will of its own, as if it wanted to be found. It smelled like every good thing that had ever happened in every kitchen in the world. It smelled like the first time you tasted something homemade and realized that food could be more than fuel. It smelled like the kitchen of your grandmother's house. If your grandmother's house had a kitchen, and if that kitchen had smelled like love, not the dramatic, movie scene kind of love, but the real kind, the daily kind, the kind that shows up in the form of food on a table and a towel over your shoulder and a light left on in the window. Alara's eyes were fully closed now. She was not asleep, not yet, but she was in that luminous, floaty space that exists just above sleep, the space where the boundaries between the body and the world begin to soften and blur, where the sounds around you become part of a dream that hasn't quite formed yet, where the mind is still and the heart is open and everything feels possible and nothing needs to be done. And the people in the town, the ones who were sheltering in their homes, listening to the storm, feeling the walls shake and the windows rattle, they smelled it too. Every single one of them. And the smell did something to them. It didn't make the storm stop. It didn't fix anything. It simply reminded them of something they had forgotten, that they were warm, that they were dry, that they were safe inside their houses, and that outside the world was doing what the world does, which is to be wild and unpredictable and occasionally occasionally terrifying, but also to water the fields and fill the rivers and wash the dust off the leaves, and that these things are not separate, not good or bad, but simply part of the same enormous, incomprehensible, beautiful whole. Barnaby let out a soft, muffled whine in his sleep. His legs twitched more definitely now, both back legs, moving in a gentle, synchronized rhythm that suggested he was running through that imaginary field, chasing that imaginary ball, living his best imaginary life. The sound of his whine was so small, so quiet, so utterly unthreatening, that it seemed to blend with the rain and the hum of the bakery and Marguerite's voice, becoming another thread in the tapestry of sound that was wrapping itself around Alara like the softest blanket in the world. The storm passed eventually. Storms always do. And when it was over, the woman opened her front door, and the world was clean, really clean, the way the world only gets after a storm, when every surface has been washed and every color has been deepened, and the air smells like the beginning of things. And there, on her porch, she found something that had never been there before. Marguerite paused. The pause was long, long enough for the rain to fill it, long enough for the silence to become its own kind of story, long enough for Alara to drift a little further down into that warm, dark, safe place where stories go when they're almost done. A basket full of things. Not bread, the woman was the bread maker after all. Other things, jars of honey, bundles of herbs, a knitted scarf in a color that was the exact shade of the sky just after a storm clears. A small painting of a kitchen with an oven glowing orange. A note written in a hand that was careful and slightly shaky that said, "Thank you. We didn't know we needed you until we smelled your bread. We will never forget." There was no name on the note. There was no way to know who had left the basket or how many people had contributed to it. or how they had known to leave it at this particular moment. The woman stood on her porch in the clean, washed, post-storm world, and she looked at the basket, and she cried. Not because she was sad, not because she was happy, but because she was felt. She was known. She was seen, not for anything she had tried to do or tried to be, but for what she simply was. A woman who baked bread and left it on her porch and trusted that it would find its way to where it was needed. And that, Marguerite said, is the story of this bakery. Elara opened her eyes just slightly, just enough to see through the narrow, half-moon slits of her lids. Marguerite was sitting in the chair across from her, hands still folded in her lap, smiling that simple, unassuming smile. The amber light from the street lamp outside fell through the fogged window and landed on Marguerite's face in a way that made her look like a painting of a woman in a bakery on a rainy evening, a painting that would hang in a gallery and make people stop and stare and feel something they couldn't name. The woman was you, Elara said. It was the first thing she had said since entering the bakery. Her voice came out soft and slightly hoarse, as if it had been asleep and was just waking up, confused about where it was. Marguerite's smile widened just a fraction. The woman was everyone who has ever done something quiet and good and necessary without knowing if it mattered. The woman was the baker, yes, but she was also the one who left the basket and the one who wrote the note and the one who smelled the bread and felt for a moment that everything was going to be all right. The woman was all of us, dear. She was all of us. Some time passed. Elara did not know how much. It might have been minutes. It might have been hours. It might have been days. The clock on the wall, if it could be believed, was still not moving, and the rain was still falling, and the bakery was still warm, and Marguerite was still in her chair, and Barnaby was still in his armchair, and the old man was still in his corner, and the two young women were still at their table. And yet something had shifted, something subtle and deep, like the shift that happens in the sky just before dawn, when the darkness doesn't look any different, but you can feel in some ancient, instinctive part of yourself that the light is coming. Marguerite rose from her chair and went to the counter, and she came back carrying a small paper bag. It was a simple bag, brown paper, folded over at the top. No label, no logo, no branding of any kind. She set it on the table beside Alara's empty mug. For tomorrow, she said, for the morning, for when you wake up and the rain has stopped and the world looks different, cleaner, sharper, more real, and you need something to remind you that this afternoon was real too. Because it was real, you know. This place is real. Not everyone can see it, and not everyone can find it, and it doesn't appear for everyone. But it appeared for you. That means something. Alara took the bag. It was warm, warm the way everything in the bakery was warm. Warm the way a hand is warm when it has been resting on your shoulder. Warm in a way that felt personal and intentional, as if the warmth was not a byproduct of baking, but a message. A small, wordless communication from the bakery to her, saying, I see you. I held you. Now go. She stood up. Her legs were slightly stiff, the way legs get when you've been sitting in one position for a long time. But the stiffness didn't feel unpleasant. It felt like the stiffness of rest, like the stiffness of a body that has finally, fully stopped and is now remembering how to start again, slowly, carefully, with intention. She walked to the door. The bell made its warm, resonant hum as she opened it, and the sound followed her out into the rain like a goodbye. She stepped under the awning. The rain was lighter, now much lighter, barely more than a mist, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as float, suspended in the air like a question that hasn't been asked yet. The air was cool against her face, and it smelled of wet stone and wet leaves, and the particular clean freshness of a world that has been thoroughly rained on. And she breathed it in deeply, filling her lungs, and the coolness of it was a shock after the warmth of the bakery. But it was a good shock, the kind that wakes you up without being cruel about it. She turned back to look at the bakery one more time. Through the window, she could see Marguerite behind the counter, wiping down the surface with that ancient cloth. She could see Barnaby in his armchair, still sleeping, still twitching, still dreaming his dog dreams. She could see the old man in the corner, his book closed on the table before him, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep. She could see the two young women, the one still drawing, the one still watching, their private bubble of companionship intact and undisturbed. And she could see the light, the warm, golden, oven glow light that filled the bakery from wall to wall and ceiling to floor, the light that made everything inside look like it was being held in something precious, something protective, something that would not let any harm come to anything within its reach. Ilara looked at the light, and the light looked back at her, and something passed between them, not a message, not a promise, not a lesson, but something simpler and older than all of those things. A recognition, maybe, a remembering, a moment of knowing, without any doubt, without any need for proof or explanation, that warmth exists, that kindness exists, that there are places in the world, hidden places, secret places, places that appear only when you need them, where you can sit and be still, and be warm and be fed, and be held by nothing more than the simple, extraordinary fact of being exactly where you need to be. She turned away. She stepped out from under the awning and into the mist. The rain landed on her face in tiny, delicate particles, and she felt each one, and each one felt like a small kiss, like the world saying, "Welcome back. I missed you. It's good to see you again." She walked home along Millbrook Lane. The street lamps glowed amber, and the puddles reflected their light in wobbling, liquid patterns on the pavement. Her shoes made soft, wet sounds on the sidewalk, squish, squish, squish. And the sound was rhythmic and soothing, like a heartbeat, like the rain, like Marguerite's voice, like all the good and gentle rhythms of the world that are always there, always playing, if you can just quiet yourself enough to hear them. She did not look back again. She didn't need to. The bakery was inside her now, not in the literal sense, not physically, but in the way that some experiences embed themselves in your body, in your bones, in the deep, quiet places where you store the things that matter. The warmth was there. The smell was there. The sound of the bell was there. The feel of the cushion beneath her. The taste of the tea on her tongue. The sight of Barnaby's twitching legs. And the old man's magnificent mustache. And the charcoal whispering across the sketchbook paper. All of it was there, packed neatly into the space behind her sternum, where she could access it whenever she needed to, which she suspected would be often. She arrived home. She opened her door. She went inside. She set the paper bag on the kitchen counter. She did not open it, not yet. That was for tomorrow, for the morning, for the time after sleep, when the world would be new again, and she would need something to anchor her to the afternoon that had just passed, to prove to herself that it was real, that it had happened, that there was a bakery on Millbrook Lane that appeared when you needed it and disappeared when you didn't, and that inside it there was a woman named Marguerite who baked bread that tasted like safety and poured tea that tasted like gardens and told stories that tasted like truth. She got ready for bed. She brushed her teeth. She changed into her softest clothes, the ones that are so soft they barely feel like clothes at all, that feel more like an extension of your own skin, like a second layer of you that is even gentler than the first. She turned off the lights. She got into bed. The sheets were cool. The blanket was warm. The pillow was firm enough to support her head and soft enough to feel like a cloud, if clouds had a texture. If you could press your cheek against a cloud and feel it yield beneath you the way a good pillow yields, not too much, not too little, but exactly right. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling. It was dark, the kind of dark that is not empty, but full of the shadows of furniture and the faint glow of the street lamp outside seeping around the edges of the curtains, and the deeper darkness of the corners where the light doesn't reach. And in that darkness, she could see them, the tiny golden stars that Marguerite had painted on the ceiling of the bakery. Not really, of course. They weren't on her bedroom ceiling. They were in her mind's eye, in that interior space where memories live and dreams begin. And they were glowing softly, each one slightly different in size and shape, as if they were trying to capture the exact moment when a sky full of stars first begins to appear at dusk. She closed her eyes, and the rain was there. Not the rain outside. She couldn't hear it anymore. Not from her bedroom. Not through the walls and the windows and the blanket and the pillow, but the rain from the bakery, the rain from the story, the rain that had been falling all afternoon in that gentle, unhurried, perfectly patient way. The rain that had accompanied her into the bakery and stayed with her while she drank her tea and ate her scone and listened to Marguerite's voice and watched the world through a fogged window. That rain was still falling. Somewhere inside her, somewhere deep and safe and warm, and it was falling on the field where Barnaby was running, and it was falling on the garden where the chamomile and lavender grew, and it was falling on the roof of a small house at the end of a small lane in a small town where a woman had once baked bread and left it on her porch and trusted that it would find its way to where it was needed. And it had. It always had. It always would. The rain fell. The warmth held. The stars glowed. And Alara, tired, warm, held, seen, fed, and finally still drifted down into sleep the way a leaf drifts down from a tree in autumn. Slowly, gently, without resistance, without fear, trusting completely that the ground would be there to catch her. And it was. And it did. And she slept. And if you are still awake, dear listener, if your eyes are still open and your mind is still turning and your body is still holding onto the day like a child holding onto a parent's hand at the edge of a playground, not quite ready to let go, then allow me to tell you one more thing, one last thing, before the story ends. The bakery is still there. It is still on Millbrook Lane, between the clockmaker's shop and the candle store. It is still warm, still golden, still full of the smell of bread and cinnamon and butter and flour. Marguerite is still behind the counter, and Barnaby is still in his armchair, and the old man is still reading his book, and the clock on the wall is still not moving, and it is there for you, not just for Alara, not just for the characters in this story, for you right now, lying in your bed in the dark, with your blanket pulled up and your eyes growing heavier and heavier with every word. The bakery is there for you, and it will be there tomorrow, and the next day, and every rainy day that comes after that, waiting with its door open and its light on, and its oven warm, ready to receive you whenever you need to be received. You don't need to find it. You don't need to look for it. You don't need to do anything at all except close your eyes and let yourself be carried by the rain. Let yourself be warmed by the light. Let yourself be held by the story. Let yourself drift. Drift now. Drift like the rain. Drift like the scent of bread through an open window. Drift like a leaf, like a cloud, like a breath, like a note of music that has left the instrument and is traveling through the air, looking for a place to land. Land here, in the warmth, in the quiet, in the safety of a story that has no villains and no conflicts and no cliffhangers. Because sometimes, just sometimes, and especially at night, and especially in the rain, what you need is not excitement, but peace. Not adventure, but stillness. Not a reason to stay awake, but a permission to sleep. So here it is. Your permission. Close your eyes. Let go. The rain will fall. The bread will bake. The dog will dream. The old man will breathe. The charcoal will whisper. The clock will not move. And Marguerite will be there in her flour-dusted apron, wiping down the counter with her ancient cloth, smiling her simple, unassuming smile, keeping the bakery warm for anyone who needs it, which is everyone, which is you. Sleep now, sleep well, sleep deeply, and when you wake, the world will be clean and new and washed and ready for you, just as it always is, just as you always are. She woke the way a person wakes when they have slept deeply and truly, not with a jolt, not with the sudden, gasping jerk of an interrupted dream, not with the groaning reluctance of someone who does not want to face the day, but slowly, gently, like surfacing from deep water, like rising through warm layers of nothing into something, like a flower opening in the morning because the light told it to, and the flower, having no reason to resist, simply obeyed. Alara's eyes opened to a thin strip of gray light seeping through the gap between her curtains. The light was not the sharp, commanding light of a sunny morning, the kind that barges into a room and demands attention, that says, "Get up, get going. There is too much to do, and you are already behind. No, this was a different light. This was a shy light, a tentative light, a light that seemed almost embarrassed to be there, as if it had arrived early and was waiting quietly in the hallway for the proper time to announce itself. It was the light of an overcast morning, a morning after rain, when the sky is still heavy with clouds, but the rain has stopped, and the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. She lay still for a moment. This, in itself, was unusual. Alara was not a person who lay still. She was a person who woke and immediately began reaching for her phone, checking the time, mentally compiling the list of tasks that awaited her. Already halfway through the day before her feet had touched the floor. But this morning she lay still. She lay still because her body felt different, not rested in the ordinary sense of the word, not simply untired, but something deeper, something more fundamental, as if the sleep she had experienced had not merely paused her, but had repaired her, had gone through her system like a slow, warm current, finding all the places where things had been bent or bruised or stretched too thin, and gently, patiently pressing them back into their proper shape. She breathed in. The air in her bedroom was cool and clean and faintly damp, the way air always smells after a day of rain, as if the world has been washed and hung out to dry, and is still carrying the memory of water in its pores. Beneath the dampness, she could smell something else, something faint, something that might have been imagined, something that was either a memory or a ghost, or a lingering trace of the bakery that had followed her home and embedded itself in the walls of her apartment, and was now releasing itself, molecule by molecule, into the morning air. Bread, she smelled bread, warm bread, fresh bread, bread that was golden on the outside and soft on the inside, and had been baked by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it for a very long time. She sat up. The blanket fell away from her shoulders, and the cool air touched her skin, and she shivered, not unpleasantly, but in the way that makes you feel alive, that makes you feel the boundary between your body and the world, that makes you appreciate the warmth you are about to return to when you pull the blanket back up or step into a hot shower or wrap your hands around a mug of something steaming. She stood. She walked to the kitchen, and there on the counter, exactly where she had left it, was the paper bag. It was still warm, not oven warm, not fresh from the bakery warm, but warm in a way that defied logic, defied physics, defied the ordinary rules that govern the behavior of paper bags and the things inside them. It was warm the way a stone is warm after sitting in the sun all day, holding onto heat that should have dissipated hours ago, as if warmth for this particular bag was not a temporary condition, but a permanent quality, an essential part of what it was, like the color of the paper or the creases where it had been folded. Alara picked it up. The warmth seeped into her palms, and from her palms into her wrists, and from her wrists into her forearms, traveling up her body in a slow, spreading wave that was not unlike the feeling of the tea the day before, the chamomile and lavender and honey tea that had moved through her like a quiet revolution, changing things without making any noise about it. She unfolded the top of the bag. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that was so soft it might have been made of clouds, or at least of the material that clouds would use if they decided to make cloth, was a loaf of bread. It was small and round and golden, with a crackled crust that caught the gray morning light and held it glowing faintly, as if the bread itself was a small domestic sun. The crackles in the crust were not random. They formed patterns, subtle and swirling, almost like the patterns rain makes on a window pane, or the patterns veins make on a leaf, or the patterns stars make when you connect them with imaginary lines and call them constellations. Alara lifted the bread out of the bag. It was heavier than it looked, heavy the way good bread is always heavier than it looks, dense with moisture and substance, and the invisible weight of time spent rising and resting and becoming itself. She held it to her nose and inhaled, and the smell that rose from it was, well, it was the smell from the story, the smell that had reached beyond the kitchen and beyond the house and out into the storm itself. It was every good thing that had ever happened in every kitchen in the world. It was the kitchen of your grandmother's house. It was honey and butter and warm spice and something else, something that tasted like the feeling of being safe. It was all of these things, and none of these things, because the smell of this bread was not a smell that could be described in words any more than the color of a sunset could be described in numbers. It was a smell that bypassed the analytical mind entirely and went straight to the place where memories live, the place where dreams are born, the place where the things that make us human are stored like treasures in a vault that has no lock because it doesn't need one. No one ever tries to steal the things that are truly valuable, because the things that are truly valuable are the things that can't be taken. She tore off a piece. The crust crackled under her fingers, a sound so satisfying, so perfectly textured, so absolutely right in its crispness and its giving way that it seemed to exist in a category of sound all its own, a category that included the sound of a fire crackling and the sound of snow crunching underfoot and the sound of a book's spine being opened for the first time. Inside, the crumb was golden and open and slightly shiny, with irregular holes that spoke of a long, slow fermentation of dough that had been allowed to take its time, to rise at its own pace, to develop flavor and character and depth in the way that only things that are not rushed can develop. As she put the piece in her mouth, and the world stopped, not dramatically, not dramatically at all. The world did not freeze or shatter or transform. The clock did not stop ticking if it was ticking. She couldn't hear it from the kitchen. The refrigerator did not stop humming. The gray light did not change. But something stopped, something internal, something invisible, something that had been running for a very long time and had not, until this exact moment, realized how tired it was. The bread tasted like the bakery, not like the physical space of the bakery, the bricks and the wood and the worn floorboards, but like the feeling of the bakery, like the feeling of sitting in the window seat and being held by warmth and listening to rain and watching the world through fogged glass, like the feeling of Marguerite's voice, low and warm and unhurried, telling a story that didn't need to go anywhere because it was already exactly where it wanted to be, like the feeling of Barnaby's soft fur and the old man's magnificent mustache and the charcoal whispering across paper and the golden stars painted on the ceiling and the clock that didn't measure time but measured something else, something more important, something that had no name because names are for things that can be contained. And this thing could not be contained, could not be pinned down, could only be felt. Alara stood in her kitchen in the gray morning light, holding a loaf of bread that should not have been warm, eating a piece of it that should not have tasted like this. And she cried. She cried the way the sky had cried the day before, gently, without drama, without sound. The tears came not from sadness, but from the opposite of sadness, from a feeling so large and so unfamiliar that her body did not know what else to do with it except turn it into salt water and let it run down her cheeks way the rain runs down a window pane, without urgency, without destination, simply because it is the nature of water to move when it is full. And she was full, so very full, full of bread and warmth, and the memory of a bakery that appeared when she needed it, and full of the dawning, tentative, fragile as a newborn bird, understanding that perhaps she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and perhaps she had set it down without realizing it, the way you set down a bag you've been carrying, and only notice the relief when someone asks you why you look lighter. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She took another piece of bread. She made tea, her own tea, from her own kettle, in her own mug. A mug that was not deep blue ceramic, but was instead a standard white mug with a chip on the rim that she had been meaning to replace for 2 years and never had. She sat at her small kitchen table, the table that was too small for the space, and wobbled slightly if you leaned on it wrong. And she ate the bread and drank the tea and looked out the window at the wet, clean, rain-washed world. The street below her apartment was glistening. Every surface, pavement, rooftops, car hoods, tree branches, the iron railing of the fire escape across the way was covered in a thin, gleaming layer of moisture that caught the gray light and reflected it back in 1,000 tiny, scattered points of brightness, like a city made of diamonds, like a world that had been polished while she slept. The trees along the street were still dripping, each leaf acting as a tiny funnel, collecting the lingering rainwater and releasing it in drops that fell to the sidewalk with small musical sounds, plink, 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 a rhythm that was irregular but not chaotic, organized by some principle that was too subtle for the human ear to parse, but that existed nonetheless. The way a pattern exists in a handful of scattered seeds, even if you can't see it. A bird landed on the railing outside her window, It was a small bird, some kind of sparrow, brown and unremarkable. The kind of bird that is so common that it is almost invisible, so ordinary that it becomes extraordinary by virtue of its absolute commitment to being itself without apology or explanation. It sat on the railing and shook its wings, a quick, fluttering shake that sent a spray of tiny water droplets into the air, each one catching the light for a fraction of a second before falling. And then it tucked its wings close to its body and sat very still, and it looked directly at Alara with one round, dark eye. And in that eye there was no fear, no aggression, no demand, no expectation. There was simply awareness. The bird saw her. She saw the bird. And for a moment, one of those moments that are too small to measure, but too significant to ignore, something passed between them that was not a thought and not a feeling, but something more primal, something that existed before thoughts and feelings, something that lived in the place where all living things are connected, the place that is always there beneath the noise and the confusion and the endless human doing, the place that says, "You are here. I am here. We are here together. That is enough." Then the bird flew away, and the moment passed, and Alara was alone in her kitchen with her bread and her tea, and the sound of the last drops of rain falling from the leaves. And she felt more clearly than she had felt anything in a very long time that she was okay, not perfect, not fixed, not transformed, not suddenly radiant with wisdom or overflowing with joy or liberated from all her struggles. Just okay. Okay the way a house is okay after a storm, still standing, still solid, maybe a little weathered, maybe a few shingles missing, but fundamentally intact, fundamentally sound, fundamentally capable of doing what a house is supposed to do, which is to keep the inside in and the outside out, and to provide a place where someone can sit and drink tea and eat bread and watch a bird shake the rain from its wings. Okay was enough. Okay was more than enough. Okay was, she was beginning to suspect, the thing she had been looking for all along, hidden beneath the heavier, more complicated things she had been carrying, the ambitions and the anxieties and the shoulds and the musts and the endless, exhausting project of trying to be more than she was. Okay was the destination she had been traveling toward without knowing it. And she had arrived, and the bread was warm, and the tea was hot, and the world was clean. So she went to work. The bookshop where Alara worked was called the Turning Page, and it occupied a narrow storefront on the far end of Millbrook Lane, far enough from the rainy day bakery that she would not pass it on her way. She would have to go out of her way to pass it, would have to make a deliberate choice to walk in that direction. And she was not yet sure if she was ready for that, was not yet sure what would happen if she walked to the spot between the clockmaker's shop and the candle store and found what? An empty shop with a dark window. The bakery glowing and warm and real. Nothing at all, not even a space where a shop could be. Just the clockmaker's shop and the candle store with no gap between them. As if the bakery had never existed, as if it had been a dream, a hallucination, a story she had told herself on a rainy afternoon because she needed a story, and the rain had provided one. So she did not go to look, not yet. Instead, she walked the other way along the wet pavement, past the houses with their window boxes full of rain-dimpled flowers, past the little park where the benches were dark with moisture, and the grass was so green it looked almost artificial, past the church with its stained glass windows that were dull and muted in the gray light, but which she knew would blaze with color when the sun finally broke through, as it surely would, because the sky, no matter how heavy, cannot hold the clouds forever. The bookshop was quiet when she arrived. It was always quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full. The quiet of a place that takes its silence seriously, that guards it the way a dragon guards gold, that understands that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention, of space, of room for thoughts to unfurl and feelings to settle, and the mind to stretch out in all directions like a cat in a sunbeam. Mr. Alderman, the owner of the turning page, was standing behind the counter when she walked in. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair that stood up from his head in directions that defied gravity and combing. And he wore the same thing he wore every day: a cardigan that was once navy blue and was now a faded, comfortable indigo, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a pair of brown trousers that had been pressed so many times that the creases were permanent features of the fabric, like geological layers in a cliff face. He had half-moon reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and he was peering over them at a large, leather-bound catalog that was spread open on the counter before him. "Good morning, Alara," he said, without looking up. His voice was dry and precise, the voice of a man who had spent his life among books and had absorbed some of their qualities, their orderliness, their patience, their quiet confidence that everything worth saying has already been said, and the best you can do is arrange it well. "Good morning, Mr. Alderman." He looked up then. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, and then he returned his gaze to the catalog. But in those 2 or 3 seconds, something happened. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in the way that eyes narrow when they are trying to read fine print, or when they are trying to see something that is not quite visible, something that is hovering just beneath the surface of appearances. It was the look of a man who noticed things, who had trained himself over a lifetime of examining book spines and dust jackets and first editions to see the details that others missed, the slightly off-center lettering, the faded gilt on the spine, the tiny inscription on the frontispiece that changed a book's value from ordinary to extraordinary. "You look different," he said, still not looking up. Different how? He considered this. He turned a page of the catalogue. He adjusted his glasses. He stroked his chin with a long, bony finger. "Settled," he said finally. "You look settled, like a book that's been put on the right shelf after being misplaced for a long time." He said this as if it were the most ordinary observation in the world, as if he were commenting on the weather or the price of tea or the number of pages in a novel. He did not elaborate. He did not ask follow-up questions. He did not probe or pry or express concern or curiosity. He simply noted what he saw, the way a naturalist notes a rare bird interesting. There it is, and then moved on, because some things, once observed, do not need to be discussed. They simply need to be witnessed. Ilara went to the back of the shop and hung up her coat and put on her apron, a dark green apron with the name of the bookshop embroidered on the chest in gold thread. And she began her work. She shelved returns. She dusted the shelves slowly, carefully, running the cloth along each shelf with the same attention that Marguerite gave to her counter, finding a satisfaction in the act of cleaning that she had never noticed before, a meditative quality in the repetitive motion, the way the cloth moved across the wood, and the dust disappeared, and the wood was revealed, grain by grain, warm and honest and patient. She straightened the books that customers had pulled out and left sitting at odd angles, adjusting them so that their spines were aligned, so that they stood shoulder to shoulder like well-behaved children, each one taking up exactly as much space as it needed and no more. As she worked, she thought about the bakery. She thought about it not in the way you think about a memory, not as something receding, something fading, something becomes less vivid with each passing hour. But in the way you think about a place you have been that has changed you, a place that has left a mark so deep that it has become part of your internal geography, a landmark you can return to in your mind whenever you need to. The way a sailor returns to a lighthouse, not for shelter, but for orientation, for the reassurance of knowing where you are in relation to something fixed and solid and permanent. She thought about the warmth, how it had felt not like heat applied to the outside of her body, but like warmth generated from within, as if the bakery had reached inside her and lit a small fire in the place where her center of gravity lived. And that fire was still burning. She could feel it now. A low, steady glow in her chest, not dramatic enough to be noticed by anyone else, but unmistakable to her, like a pilot light that had been lit for the first time in years. She thought about the sound of the rain against the window, how it had been not a noise, but a texture, not an interruption, but a layer, something that wove itself into the fabric of the moment rather than disturbing it. The way a thread of gold woven into a tapestry does not disrupt the pattern, but enriches it, becomes part of it, makes the whole thing more beautiful than it would have been without it. She thought about Marguerite's voice, how it had been not a performance, but a presence, not a delivery, but a gift, each word placed with the care of a jeweler setting a stone, not just any stone, but the right stone in the right setting at the right angle, so that when the light hit it, it did something extraordinary. She thought about the clock that didn't measure time, and she thought she allowed herself, for the first time, to think that perhaps what the clock measured was not the distance between where you are and where you need to be, as Marguerite had suggested, nor the distance between who you are and who you're becoming, but something simpler and stranger and more radical than either of those things. Perhaps the clock measured the distance between this moment and the moment when you finally, fully completely allow yourself to be here in this moment, in this body, in this life, without wanting to be somewhere else, without trying to be someone else, without reaching for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing in the endless, exhausting chain of reaching that had defined so much of her life for so long. Perhaps the clock was a reminder that that distance was always zero, that you were always already here, that the place you were trying to get to was the place you had never left, that the person you were trying to become was the person you had always been. Underneath all the layers of striving and achieving and proving and performing and trying so very, very hard to be worthy of the simple, extraordinary fact of existing. Or perhaps the morning passed. Customers came and went, few of them, because it was a gray, damp morning, and people tended to stay indoors on such mornings, preferring the warmth of their homes to the lure of bookshops. Even bookshops as wonderful as the turning page. But those who did come were the kind of customers who come to bookshops on gray, damp mornings, which is to say they were the best kind of customers, the kind who came not looking for anything specific, but open to everything, the kind who wandered the aisles slowly, letting their fingers trail along the spines, the kind who pulled a book from the shelf not because of its cover or its title or its author, but because of some instinct they couldn't explain, some inner tug that said this one, this is the one you need right now, trust me. Elara watched them. She had always watched them, but this morning she watched them differently. This morning she watched them the way Marguerite might have watched them, with attention that was not clinical, but compassionate, with curiosity that was not intrusive, but respectful, with the understanding that every person who walks into a bookshop is carrying something, a question, a grief, a longing, a hope, a fear, a love, and that the book they eventually choose is not chosen randomly, but is chosen by some deep inner wisdom that knows what it needs even when the conscious mind does not. An elderly woman came in around 11. She was small and round and wore a raincoat that was too large for her. The sleeves came past her wrists, and the hem hung below her knees. And she had a plastic bag over her head that she had fashioned into a makeshift rain hat, tying it under her chin with a knot that was both endearing and slightly absurd. She walked to the poetry section. She knew exactly where it was, which meant she was a regular, even though Alara had never seen her before. And she stood before the shelves for a long time, not moving, not reaching for any particular book, just standing there looking. Alara did not approach her. She did not ask if she needed help. She simply let her stand there, because standing in front of a shelf of poetry and not knowing which one to choose is a valid and important activity, and interrupting it would be like interrupting a prayer. After a while, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, time in a bookshop is as unreliable as time in a bakery. The woman reached out and took a slim volume from the shelf. She held it in both hands, the way you hold a small bird, and she opened it to a random page and read the poem that was there. And Alara, from across the shop, could see the woman's lips moving slightly as she read, forming the words without speaking them. And the sight was so tender, so private, so beautifully human that Alara had to look away, not out of discomfort, but out of a feeling that was too large to contain and needed somewhere to go. So it went into her hands, which were holding a cloth and a shelf, and she pressed the cloth against the shelf and held it there for a moment, grounding herself, anchoring herself, letting the feeling pass through her like weather. So the woman bought the book. She placed it on the counter with the care of someone placing a sleeping child in a crib. And Mr. Alderman wrapped it in brown paper, slowly, precisely, the way he wrapped all books, as if each one deserved a parcel of its own, and the woman paid and left. And as she passed through the door, she turned and looked at Alara and smiled. And the smile was small and quick and almost apologetic, as if she were apologizing for taking up space in the world. And Alara smiled back. A real smile, not the polite, automatic smile she usually gave to customers, but a real one. One that came from the same place where the fire was burning, the pilot light, the place that had been lit by the bakery. And the woman's smile widened just slightly, and something passed between them that was not a transaction, and not a greeting, and not a farewell, but something else. Something that had no name because it happened so rarely between strangers that language had never gotten around to inventing a word for it. And then the woman was gone, out into the gray morning with her plastic bag hat and her brown paper parcel and her slim volume of poetry. And Alara watched her go and felt, for the second time that day, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. At lunchtime, Alara sat in the back room of the bookshop, a small, cluttered space filled with boxes of unsorted books and a mismatched collection of furniture that included a battered desk, a filing cabinet that only opened when you lifted and turned the handle at the same time, and a chair that had been upholstered in a floral print at some point in the distant past, and was now mostly canvas with occasional patches of faded flowers, like a garden that had been mostly forgotten but was still trying. She ate the rest of the bread. She had brought it with her wrapped in the cloud-soft cloth, tucked into her bag alongside her wallet and her keys, and a pen that didn't work, and a small notebook that she carried everywhere but rarely wrote in. She unwrapped it now in the back room, and the smell rose from it again. That impossible, extraordinary storybook smell. And she broke off a piece and put it in her mouth and chewed slowly. And the taste was the same as it had been that morning, which was the same as the taste of everything good in the rainy day bakery, which was the same as the taste of being safe. And as she ate, she thought about the other people who had been in the bakery. The old man with the magnificent mustache. She thought about the way he had turned the pages of his book, not quickly, not slowly, but at the exact speed that the book wanted to be read at, as if he had developed, over many years of reading, the ability to sense the natural rhythm of a text and to match his reading to it, the way a dancer matches their movements to music. She thought about the way he had closed the book when he was done, not marking his page, not making a note of where he had stopped, just closing it and setting it aside and leaning back and closing his eyes, as if the act of reading had been a journey, and now he was home, and there was nothing more to do. She thought about how peaceful he had looked, how complete, how unbothered by any question of whether he had read enough or read the right things or read efficiently. He had simply read, and then he had simply stopped. And the simplicity of it, the breathtaking, almost radical simplicity of it, struck her now. In the back room of the bookshop, with a force that brought tears to her eyes for the second time that day, the two young women. She thought about the one who was drawing, the confidence of her strokes, the way she moved the charcoal across the page as if she were not making a picture, but translating something that already existed on the other side of the paper, bringing it through to this side, the way a medium might bring a message through from somewhere else. She thought about the way the other woman had watched, not with envy, not with boredom, not with the restless impatience of someone who wanted to be doing something else, but with that particular quality of attention that is so rare and so precious that it deserves its own word. A word that would mean the act of witnessing someone else's creation with full, loving, unconditional presence. She thought about the small, private smiles that passed between them, and she realized that what she had witnessed was not a friendship exactly, or not only a friendship, collaboration, a partnership of making and witnessing, of creating and holding space for creation, and that both roles were equally valuable, equally necessary, equally sacred. Barnaby. She thought about Barnaby, and a laugh escaped her, a small, soft laugh, barely more than an exhale, but a laugh nonetheless. The first genuine laugh she had produced in longer than she could remember. She thought about his soft, dark eyes and his gray-muzzled chin and his twitching legs and his slow, rhythmic breathing. And she thought about how Marguerite had said that he came in every rainy day and left when the rain stopped. And she thought about how beautiful it was that a dog, had figured out something that most humans never figure out, that it is possible to exist in the world without a fixed address, without a clear schedule, without a defined role or purpose, and to do so not with anxiety or confusion, but with the serene confidence of a creature who knows, in some deep, non-conceptual way, that the world will provide what is needed when it is needed, and that the only appropriate response to this provision is to find a warm armchair and go to sleep. She finished the bread. She folded the cloth and put it back in her bag. She sat in the chair with the faded flowers and closed her eyes just for a moment, just to rest, just to let the warmth and the taste and the memories settle into their proper places, like books being returned to their correct shelves. And in that moment, with her eyes closed in the back room of a bookshop on a gray morning after rain, she heard something, not with her ears, with something deeper, something that listened from a place below the ears, below the skull, below the thinking mind. She heard the bell, the warm, resonant hum of the bell above the door of the rainy day bakery. She heard it the way you hear a song in a dream, not as sound, but as feeling, not as vibration, but as memory, not as something coming from outside, but as something rising from within, like a spring that has been flowing underground for a long time and has finally found an opening in the earth and is bubbling up, warm and clear and sweet, into the light. The hum lasted only a second, maybe less than a second. Maybe it was not a second at all, but a fraction of a fraction, a quantum of sound, a single note played on an instrument made of memory and warmth and the smell of bread. But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a thread connecting her to the bakery, connecting the bakery to the world, connecting the world to the rain, and the rain to the earth, and the earth to the wheat, and the wheat to the flour, and the flour to the bread, and the bread to her hands, and her hands to her mouth, and her mouth to her body, and her body to the chair, and the chair to the floor, and the floor to the building, and the building to the street, and the street to the town, and the town to the sky, and the sky to the clouds, and the clouds to the rain. And the whole thing, the entire, enormous, impossibly complex web of connection, pulsed with that single hum, that single note, that single moment of recognition. You are here. You are part of this. You belong. She opened her eyes. The back room was the same. The boxes, the desk, the filing cabinet, the chair with the faded flowers. Gray light came through the small window. Somewhere in the shop, a clock ticked, or perhaps it was Mr. Alderman turning pages of his catalog. It was hard to tell. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The afternoon brought more customers. A small cluster of students from the university who came in looking for textbooks and left with novels, which Mr. Alderman said was the highest compliment a bookshop could receive. A middle-aged couple who spent 20 minutes in the travel section and left with a cookbook, which was also somehow a compliment. A young man who walked directly to the philosophy section pulled out a thick, dense volume with a plain black cover and read the first page while standing in the aisle and then put it back and left without buying anything. And Alara could tell from the way he closed the book that he would be back for it, that it had done its work on him, even in that single page, had planted a seed that would grow in the dark soil of his mind until it became too large to ignore, and he would return. And she was glad, because she knew what it felt like to be changed by a single page, to be spoken to by words on a paper, in a voice that seemed to come from inside your own head, but was somehow wiser and kinder and more truthful than your own voice had ever been. Between customers, Alara found herself drawn to the window. She stood behind the display table that held the new arrivals, the books that Mr. Alderman had selected that week, arranged with the geometric precision of a museum exhibit, each one angled just so, each one accompanied by a small handwritten card on which Mr. Alderman had composed a single sentence describing why this book, why now, why you should pick it up and take it home. And she looked out at Millbrook Lane. The clouds were thinning, not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, the way they do when they have finished raining and are ready to move on, like guests at a party who have said what they came to say and are now gathering their coats and making their way to the door, pausing occasionally to exchange one last word, one last laugh, before stepping out into the night. Between the thinning clouds, patches of pale blue sky were becoming visible, not the deep, vivid blue of a summer afternoon, but a softer blue, a tentative blue, a blue that was still waking up, still remembering what it looked like when it was fully itself. And through those patches of blue, light was beginning to fall. Not direct sunlight, not yet, but a kind of diffused, scattered light that came from no particular direction and illuminated everything equally, the way a mother's gaze falls on all her children at once, without preference, without hierarchy, simply seeing them, all of them, each one perfectly lit by the same impartial, unconditional glow. The wet pavement caught this light and turned it into something extraordinary. Every puddle became a mirror, not a clear mirror, not a mirror that reflected the world with photographic accuracy, but a soft mirror, a liquid mirror, a mirror that turned the buildings and the trees and the sky into impressionist paintings, all blurred edges and blended colors, and the sense that the world was not a fixed, solid thing, but a flowing, changing, breathing entity that was being continuously remade by the light and the water and the air. Elara pressed her hand against the window glass. It was cool, still cool, even though the clouds were thinning and the light was growing, and the coolness traveled from the glass into her palm, and from her palm into her wrist, and from her wrist into the same channel that the bread's warmth had traveled through that morning. And the coolness and the warmth met somewhere in the middle of her arm and did not cancel each other out, but coexisted, the way rain and sun can coexist in the same sky, the way sadness and happiness can coexist in the same heart, the way a person can be both tired and hopeful at the same time. And it is not a contradiction, but a completeness, a wholeness, a fullness of being that contains multiple truths at once. The way a single moment can contain both an ending and a beginning. And the ending is not sad, and the beginning is not frightening. They simply are, they simply exist, side by side, like two books on the same shelf, each one complete in itself, each one contributing to the richness of the collection. She watched a child walk past the bookshop. The child was very small, 3 years old, maybe 4, and was wearing a yellow raincoat and yellow rain boots, and was being held by the hand by an adult whose face Elara could not see because the adult was on the other side of the child, farther from the window. The child was not walking in a straight line. The child was walking in a curve, a wide, swooping curve that followed the edge of the pavement, and with every step, the child's yellow boot landed in a puddle, and the puddle splashed, and the child laughed, a pure, uncomplicated, unself-conscious laugh that was the most beautiful sound Elara had heard all day, possibly all week, possibly all month. The child did not care that the puddles were wet. The child did not care that the boots would need to be cleaned. The child did not care about the destination. There was clearly a destination, because the adult was pulling gently in a particular direction. But the child cared about the puddles, and the puddles were there, and so the child splashed through them. Because when you are 3 years old and the world is full of puddles, and you are wearing boots that were made for splashing, the only logical thing to do is to splash. And any adult who tells you otherwise has forgotten something essential about what it means to be alive. Elara watched the child until it disappeared around the corner, its yellow coat a small, bright spot of color against the gray and silver landscape, and she thought, that is what the bakery felt like. Not the child, the splashing. The unhesitating, unapologetic, full-bodied immersion in the thing that is right in front of you. The refusal to go around the puddle when you can go through it. The understanding that joy is not found at the destination, but in the puddles along the way. She realized with a start that this was the longest she had gone without checking her phone since before she could remember. She had not looked at it once that morning, not when she woke up, not when she ate the bread, not when she walked to work, not in the back room during her break. It was still in her bag, and it was probably full of messages and notifications and the usual cascade of digital demands that constituted the background noise of modern life, and she did not care. She did not care the way the child did not care about the puddles being wet. She did not care because something larger and more important was happening. She was here in this moment, in this bookshop, in this body, in this life, and the phone could wait, could always wait. Because the phone was a puddle she did not want to splash in, a path she did not need to follow, a voice that was not the voice she needed to hear. The voice she needed to hear was the voice of the rain, the voice of the bread, the voice of Marguerite telling a story about a woman who baked bread and left it on her porch and trusted that it would find its way to where it was needed. The voice that said, "You are where you need to be. That is enough. That has always been enough." The workday ended. Alara said goodbye to Mr. Alderman, who nodded from behind his catalog in a way that was neither warm nor cold, but simply acknowledge. The way a tree acknowledges the wind by being there, by being solid, by not being blown away. She put on her coat. She gathered her things, the bag with the cloud-soft cloth folded inside, the pen that didn't work, the notebook she rarely wrote in. She stepped outside. The clouds had broken. Not completely. The sky was not a clear, blue, cloudless expanse, but enough. Enough to let the late afternoon sun through, and the sun, when it appeared, was extraordinary. It was low in the sky, the kind of low that happens in autumn, when the sun seems to have decided to take a more leisurely path across the heavens, moving slowly and deliberately, as if it too has learned that there is no value in rushing, and its light was golden, not pale gold, not white gold, but deep, rich amber gold, the color of honey in a jar, the color of the crust of the bread, the color of the light that glowed from the windows of the rainy day bakery. The golden light fell on Millbrook Lane and transformed it. The wet pavement, which had been silver under the gray light, became a river of gold, and the puddles, those same puddles that the child in the yellow coat had splashed through, became pools of liquid amber, each one reflecting the sky and the buildings and the trees in colors that were so warm and so saturated that they looked like they belonged in a painting or a dream or a story about a bakery that appeared when you needed it and disappeared when you didn't. Alara stood on the sidewalk in front of the turning page and let the golden light fall on her face. She closed her eyes. She felt the warmth on her eyelids, gentle, diffuse, the warmth not of direct sun, but of sun filtered through the last remaining wisps of cloud, softened and spread, and made tender by its journey through the atmosphere. She felt the cool air on her cheeks. She smelled the post-rain smell, the stone and the earth and the clean, washed freshness of a world that has been through something and come out the other side cleaner for it. And she made a decision. She was going to walk to the bakery, not because she needed to prove it was real, not because she needed another loaf of bread, another cup of tea, another story, but because she wanted to see it in this light, the golden, late afternoon, post-rain light, because she suspected that the bakery in this light would be something even more extraordinary than the bakery in the gray, rainy light.